I'm confused. How do you screen record? Hello everyone, my name is Yara, and today I'm going to be tier ranking every single book that I read in 2024. In 2024, I read a total of 31 books, which was pretty on par for me. Every year my goal is to read 30 books, so I'm just glad that I made that number. This year I kind of didn't do a good job of keeping up with my wrap-ups, but we're here today to actually just rank them all. I wanted to find some way to kind of just reflect over all the books that I read and kind of put them in perspective, rank them on how much I enjoyed them, how they compared relative to each other. And I find tier ranking fun because it's a little bit more reflective of my opinions than like a simple star rating. Star ratings sometimes stress me out because I'm like, these two can both be 4 stars, but also be very different. So even though I read 31 books this year, I'm only including 27 on this tier list because 4 of them were the Percy Jackson series that I reread. And like, my opinions on those books are very well known. Check out my Percy Jackson folder on my channel. So let us begin with the ranking. So the highest tier that we have is Can't Stop Thinking About It. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's books that I just find myself thinking back on and really remembering how I felt and still processing what happened in those books. Like, they left a mark on me. The next tier is Lovely. These are books that perhaps didn't make it to like a full 5 stars, but I thoroughly enjoyed them and I would definitely recommend them. The next tier is I'm Glad I Read It. And this year particularly, this was important for me to include because there's a lot of books that were kind of out of my comfort zone, things that I don't typically read, that I think I gained a lot from, even if I didn't particularly enjoy the process of reading them or perhaps wouldn't reread, but they gave me insight into something or just allowed me to like push my boundaries and try something new. The fourth category is You Were Good, I'm Waiting on You to Be Great, as made famous by Abby Lee Miller of Dance Moms. I think I also read a lot of books this year that were like so close to being really good and that I saw the vision, but just there were some things that held them back. And last tier I have is just A Sad Face. I don't really have any books that I like thoroughly disliked or hated and would want to crap on. I just had some books that were like, I had really high hopes and they unfortunately disappointed me. So, Sad Face. So let us begin. We're going to be going in order of when I read them this year. So the first one was A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. And this one is going to go in You Were Good, I'm Waiting on You to Be Great. This is kind of like a Welsh-inspired historical fantasy with dark academia vibes. There's kind of a mystery that the main characters are trying to solve regarding a really famous author and whether he was actually the author of his most famous works. I love the setup, I love the ideas and the message that this book was trying to say. I think Ava Reid had a very clear intention of what kind of story she was trying to portray with this, but it ultimately felt like the story was wrapped around those themes instead of coming naturally out of them, if that makes sense. Because the narrative started to fall apart a little bit by the end and was a little over-explained just to kind of like wrap things up really nicely, and it didn't feel as organic. I still really enjoyed it. There was a lot about being a survivor of sexual assault as well as dealing with misogyny in academia, and I also liked the romance that we had as well as felt pulled by the mystery. I just think the execution didn't really land as well as it could have been in the end. The next book we have is Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. This is a collection of short stories that it's a little hard to kind of pull together into one common idea, but basically they all deal with either the Indian immigrant experience or just the Indian American experience in general. She explores a lot of different kinds of relationships, familial and domestic partnerships, as well as the dynamics of communities and in-groups and out-groups. And this is our first book that's going to go in Can't Stop Thinking About It. Jhumpa Lahiri is probably one of the best writers that I've ever read from on a technical level. I think her prose is gorgeous, and it was so incredibly effective because a lot of these stories that she is talking about are very mundane experiences, very small experiences as well, but she is able to convey it with such an emotional weight that I still think about 10 months later after I read this book. I think in my rating, I didn't give it a full 5 stars because there were some stories that I think were weaker than others, but I think on the whole, most of them were very, very good. The next book is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, and this one was probably one of the most ideologically fascinating books I read this year. This is a dystopian novel that ironically takes place in 2024, and it kind of follows the aftermath of a lot of civil anarchy, climate change, civil unrest, We are following a girl named Lauren Olamina who has this ability to have hyper empathy. She literally and physically feels other people's emotions, and this can be weaponized against her. And the book is written through her journal entries as she's trying to process her surroundings and form her own moral and societal philosophy. So for this one, I'm a little torn on which tier to put it at, because I ultimately gave this book 4 stars because I think while I was so intrigued by the ideas presented by Octavia Butler, I thought that the pacing and the story structure kind of lost footing in the 3rd act. And it made more sense to me once I learned that this book and its sequel, Parable of the Talents, were originally supposed to be one book, so it made sense that I felt like the pacing was a little off. But I think ultimately I do have to put it in Can't Stop Thinking About It, maybe like near the end. Just because it's true, I can't stop thinking about it. I always think about that book, especially in regards to the fact that the president in that book, his whole slogan was called Make America Great Again. There are just so many things that, even though Octavia Butler wrote that in 1990, that are relevant and still come up today. And I have a feeling that if I reread this book and read the sequel as well, I'd have less problems with the story structure and feel it was a more complete story. Next book is Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. This is a collection of essays and interviews with Angela Davis, who is a renowned social and political activist. And I think what was really valuable and poignant about Angela Davis's remarks in this collection was how she illustrated intersectionality, specifically in the activism space. This book is kind of describing the connections between domestic social movements like Black Lives Matter with international ones like the Free Palestine movement, and how we might consider these disparate ideas and completely separate issues to tackle when in reality they are connected by the same systems. And so this book I'm going to put in Can't Stop Thinking About It. We had a lot of heavy hitters in this front half of the year. This book was really good at breaking down some terms that I was familiar with but didn't really understand on a deeper level, like prison abolition. She explained things in a really accessible way and basically reframed the way that I view a lot of things in our world. This is not a book that's going to capture everything or go into too much depth, since these are all essays and speeches, nor is it going to explain everything going on in Palestine and its history. But I think it's something that can fundamentally change your perspective on the relationship between prisons and military and police with Israel and the IDF. Next book is All the Sinners Bleed by S.A. Cosby. This is a murder mystery novel about the first Black sheriff in this county in Virginia. A school shooting happens in the beginning of the book where a beloved teacher is murdered, but in trying to solve that case, they kind of uncover a trail of murders of particularly Black and Indigenous people that have not been investigated, and so the main character is just trying to figure out what is going on and take down this serial killer. So this is a book that I would not normally read. I don't really gravitate towards crime or thrillers, really. I only read it for a book club, but I surprisingly actually really enjoyed it, as much as you can enjoy something about murder. But what I found really interesting about it was the main character's kind of inner struggle with being a Black police officer in a very white supremacist town, and his relationship to the justice system, and if and or how he could actually pursue justice for these people. So I'm going to put it in I'm glad I read it. The next book is The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah, and this is a Middle Eastern inspired fantasy that is a retelling / reimagining of 1001 Nights, or Arabian Nights as it's more known in the West. The main character is a merchant named Lulu who sells illegal magic, and she has a jinn as her bodyguard, but we also get perspectives from the prince of this land as well as one of the members of the guard. This book is also going to go on You Were Good, I'm Waiting on You to Be Great. This book had some good moments. I feel like especially in the 3rd act, we finally started rolling, we finally started really delving into the world building more, but it took so long to get there. I also had some issues with the writing style. I found it quite juvenile, and it especially surprised me because this book was advertised as an adult fantasy, but the tone of the stories, as well as the characters' ages, they're only 22, I felt that it would have been better in YA, or at least I would have been a little bit more forgiving of that tone in YA. The writing was also very repetitive. She would repeat some phrases. One I remember was give chase. She said that so many times that I was getting sick of it. But I can't say that there weren't good times. I actually really liked the character dynamics, and that was what really kept me going, especially Luli and her Jin bodyguard. I love the dynamic that ended up happening between them and really giving space to their more, I don't know if it's brother-sister, mentor-mentee kind of relationship. It was just really lovely and I liked that part, but I felt like there was a lot of other things that brought the book down. Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. I am becoming a Rebecca Ross stan. She's just so good at writing romantic fantasies. Like, her relationships, chef's kiss. They're so good. This is kind of a historical, I think it's like 1920s vibes, fantasy about two rivaling journalists set in the backdrop of an impending war, or rather an active war that they end up getting looped into. I just remember devouring this book. Like, I could not put it down when I started reading it, and that's to no one's surprise. It's hugely popular right now. The only caveat is that I do think the world building was a little bit lax, a little bit underdeveloped, a little bit lax. To be fair, I don't think it affected my reading experience that much because I was just so invested in the two main characters. I forgot to mention that they communicate via letters, but they don't know who the other person is, which is a trope I really love. And I'm kind of torn again about which tier to put it in, because it doesn't feel like it fits in with the rest of these books that talk about the socio-political economic state of the world. So I'll put it in lovely. Also because I wouldn't say I think about it all the time, even though while I read it, I was so heavily invested. I think I'm getting too hung up trying to align these with my star ratings, because books have different purposes, so they're going to leave different impressions on me. But that just goes to show that sometimes, like, two things can have the same rating but be different, or they can have different ratings but kind of have a similar vibe. Just kind of take these as how I would recommend them to somebody else. This was definitely like a lovely book that I would recommend. The Girls by Emma Cline. Again, this is another book that I wouldn't have really gravitated towards if not it being a book club pick. I had not heard of this book prior to it being my book club's pick, but apparently it had like a 6 or 7 figure deal when it got published. And like, the writing is good, don't make me wrong. Emma Cline is a very talented writer, but I was just so surprised at that amount of money. I'm like, dang, why'd everyone want this book? It takes place in the 60s and it follows this young teenage girl named Evie who kind of becomes obsessed and kind of enthralled with this group of girls who are basically a cult underneath this one main patriarch. She's kind of attracted to their lifestyle of reckless abandon and just being separate from society. And the story is kind of told in 2 timelines where we see Evie as an adult reflecting on this time as well as her teenage self. So I'm gonna put it in I'm glad I read it. It definitely was a good time and I think it was kind of interesting to dive into. I liked how it kind of explored the complex interplay of wanting to be somewhere, wanting to be wanted by somebody, especially in that phase of adolescence. Again, I don't really understand why it had such that level of critical acclaim, or at least market potential by the publishers, but I would recommend it. Next is A Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. I read this in anticipation for the BBC adaptation of it. I didn't end up finishing the show actually because I found the first 2 episodes kind of boring and I could not stand what's her name? Emma something? The main character. She's very talented, but her attempt at a British accent was a little distracting. But anyway, back to the book. So this book is also a murder mystery, but it's YA. The main character is basically trying to solve the mystery of who killed this girl named Andy Bell a few years prior. A kid named Sal Singh, her boyfriend at the time, was accused of committing the crime, but Pip does not believe that, and she's trying to figure out who actually did murder her. This is one of those books where I think my rating doesn't necessarily reflect my experience of the book because I flipped through this. It was really intriguing and like I finished it in like 2 days. I was really hooked on the mystery and also the mixed media format of the book. Like there's interviews and like photographs and stuff. I listened to the audiobook and that was like a whole another experience because they really put on a whole production for this book. So I was just very entertained the whole time. Where the book succeeded in plot, it kind of lacked in character development, and I think this was influenced by just how much people I saw in the fandom talk about Pip and Ravi. I think I was expecting just way more out of that, and maybe there's more in the next books, but I just felt like we didn't really get to explore much about them. I also thought Pip was a little bit annoying at times and kept throwing herself into danger for really stupid reasons. And I think the book took a turn for the melodrama at times, where I think it was maybe pushing it a little too much. So for this book, I'll give You Were Good, I'm Waiting on You to Be Great, but I'll put it kind of high up because I think as a mystery, like, it kind of did what it needed to do. The next book is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandanna. This one right away is going up here. Again, I feel kind of bad putting this fantasy romance novel over these very critically acclaimed pieces, but at least in comparison to Divine Rivals, I do think about this book very frequently. It's a very light urban fantasy / supernatural book. There's basically a society of witches that are undercover and they're not allowed to tell anybody in their life that they are witches. The main character kind of skirts the boundaries of this rule by creating witchy content on YouTube, and she ends up getting recruited by this estate to become a teacher for these 3 young orphan witches. And of course, there's a hot Irish librarian in the mix. This book just warmed my heart. The relationship that these characters developed as a kind of found family because they're so used to being isolated as witches was so beautiful. The romance that's developed between the main character and the librarian, I forgot their names, but it was so cute and it was very well paced and worthwhile when they finally got together. I recommended this book to so many people if they want a good cozy romance. I always record when the sun is going down, so I'm sorry I have to keep changing the lighting. But anyway, next is Something More by Jackie Khalileh. This is a YA rom-com about a Palestinian-Canadian teenager named Jessie, who also happens to be autistic. At the beginning of the book, she's kind of grappling with having this new autism diagnosis and how that's going to affect her relationships and trying to tell that to other people, while also trying to explore romantic relationships for the first time, and she kind of ends up getting caught in a love triangle. And this one really pained me to say, but it is gonna go in sad face. There was a lot that was really cute about this book and that I appreciated. The author has talked about how she is also Palestinian and autistic and how she put a lot of what she wanted to have seen at that age into the book, and so I appreciated having that perspective. And surprisingly, the love triangle, at least the way the love triangle was handled, was not the thing I disliked most about this book. I think it maybe took up a little too much space in the narrative, but I actually liked the way that the love triangle was handled. I've become like a love triangle defender in recent years, just because I think it's a good opportunity to have a main character explore what they want, their values, how they want to be treated in relationships by having 2 opposing figures. And so I like that the love triangle was framed through that lens, but at the same time, I don't think it had enough depth or weight for it to carry the entire story. In general, I think there was a lot of things that the book touches on but never really goes into, and I think the fact that I think the author's writing style was also a little weak, it just kind of contributed to this overall lukewarm experience rating, which is sad because I really wanted to like this. The next book is Excuse Me While I Ugly Cry by Joya Goffney. This is also a YA contemporary rom-com, and it follows a character named Quinn who makes lists for everything. Her crushes, the school she wants to go to, how many times she's ugly cried. But one day, her journal that has all of these very vulnerable lists gets stolen, and an anonymous account starts posting pages of them, threatening to post more if she doesn't complete the tasks that she lists out in the lists. And she ends up teaming up with a boy named Carter to try to find the blackmailer. This book was so cute. It was so lovely. I think one of the best written YA rom-coms I've read. I love the use of lists as a storytelling device. Basically, every chapter begins with a different list. And it was such an effective device to have Quinn kind of confront her insecurities and fears and anxieties. There's also a lot of really great discussions that this book brings up, particularly around Quinn's relationship to her blackness and classism, especially as she exists in a predominantly white institution. And Carter was probably one of the most emotionally mature male love interests I've ever read in a YA novel. Almost to the extent of being unrealistic, but at the same time, I just loved seeing it and how they handled the issues that came up in their relationship. There were a few things that kind of stopped it from being 5 stars, and I go into more depth in that in my Goodreads review, but ultimately I loved it and I recommend it. Okay, next up we have Betrayed by Emily Henry. There's actually 4 Emily Henry books in here, so I'm just gonna do them all right now. I made a whole in-depth analysis, deep dive into reading all of Emily Henry's books. It's my last video that I posted. So I won't go into a lot of detail, I'll just describe where they land on this tier list. But if you haven't seen that video, please check it out. I worked very hard on it, so I would greatly appreciate if you watched. But let's get into it. So Betrayed, I'm putting at You Were Good, I'm Waiting on You to Be Great. Controversial, I know, but I go into a lot of depth about why I gave this 3 stars in my Emily Henry video. Book Lovers, I'm putting in Lovely, I'll put it between these two. That was my second favorite Emily Henry. Happy Place is going in sad face. That was my least favorite. And funny story, I'll put in Can't Stop Thinking About It because it was my favorite and it was the only Emily Henry that I gave 5 stars. Okay, now Piranesi by Susannah Clarke. This was a book that I had been reading to read for so long, so I'm very glad that I finally did that this year. And this is a book that, like, I don't even know how to explain it. I thought it was a myth retelling because of the satyr statue on the front. It's not. The most I can say is that you are basically just following Piranesi as he is documenting his home, this labyrinth that he lives in. And piece by piece, detail by detail, you slowly gather what's going on in the story, what's going on in the world. This was a reading experience that I have never had with any other book I've ever read. And it's one of those books that you're just like amazed at just the craft, the literary craft that Susannah Clarke has created with this. This book is not going to be for everyone. The first 20% I was like, what the heck is going on? You just kind of have to let it hit you, let the story go and follow along. So this one I'm putting in Can't Stop Thinking About It. Where should I put that? I'll put it here. Circe by Madeline Miller. I feel like everyone's going to think I give everything like 1,000,000 stars, but this one is also going to be in Can't Stop Thinking About It. This one might be my favorite book of the year. This is kind of what inspired the title of this tier, is because I initially when I finished Circe, I wasn't sure what rating to give it, but I just kept thinking about it, kept thinking about how it made me feel, the emotional journey that we went on. If you couldn't tell by the title, this is a Greek mythology retelling of the story of Circe, who is a witch that Odysseus encounters in the Odyssey. I think in the traditional narrative of the Odyssey and Greek mythology as a whole, Circe is not given that much of a story or agency. And so Madeline Miller kind of took this opportunity to flesh out her story. Despite being a myth retelling, this book is actually very grounded in humanity. It's a lot about family dynamics and being like the black sheep in the family, not really having a place in the godly world or the human world. It kind of details Circe's experiences with abandonment, with betrayal, and how she is able to grow and find power where she can. I was getting back into Epic the Musical, which is a retelling of the Odyssey, while I was listening to Circe, and so I just felt like that really added to the vibes of my experience, even though they have very different portrayals of Odysseus. But I don't know, it just ended up being a really bittersweet story about love and family and coping with immortality. On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. So this book is written as a letter from the main character Little Dog to his mother, who is illiterate. He basically kind of reflects on his childhood, his upbringing, and the complex relationship he had with his mom and grandmother, as well as his own experience being the child of Vietnamese immigrants and also being gay. I feel like this is one of those books that just kind of needs to be studied. I feel like I needed a little bit of guidance maybe from someone who is more familiar with poetry. It's not technically a poem, it is prose, but Ocean Vuong is a poet, and it is very clear in the way that he writes that poetry is his strong suit. There are passages in here and lines that are just so unbelievably beautiful and profound, and there are others that I just couldn't really wrap my brain around. I think I grew to understand and appreciate the story more once I listened to Ocean Vuong's interviews about it and him describing that the nature of the attempt of the story to write a letter to someone who is illiterate already begins as futile. And so this was kind of an experiment to explore the boundaries of written language to try to make sense of a messy and complicated situation. I don't know if it was always effective for me, but I'm still glad that I read it. So that's going here. Next is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. So this is a loose retelling of the fairy tales of Bluebeard or the Rubber Bridegroom. And so we begin with the bridegroom's perspective as he's kind of realizing that his wife has a lot more mystery behind her than he knew when he married her. And this comes to light when she is requested to go back to her childhood home, and he starts uncovering more messy details about her past. The other half of the story is exploring the wife's childhood, especially with one of her best friends, who is now missing. So one thing about this book that I want to mention is that I don't think it's correctly marketed. I feel like it's marketed as this kind of dark and gothic romance, and there definitely is that gothic feeling, especially with this mansion that they visit. It kind of has a life to its own, but the story is always framed through this perspective of the bridegroom, but in all honesty, I think that's the weakest part of the story. The strength really relies in that before timeline with the two best friends. Their names are Indigo and Azure, by the way. The two of them are convinced that they belong in the world of the Fae and fairies, and their biggest fear is being ostracized from that magic. They frequently refer to each other as not letting themselves become Susan from Narnia. And we follow them from childhood to young adulthood, and we see how their friendship is both very intimate but also very toxic, and I really enjoyed getting to explore that dynamic out of a female friendship. And so I actually really liked it, and I thought the bridegroom story kind of brought the book down, but I think I'm still gonna put it in lovely. Wicked by Gregory Maguire. I probably don't need to explain to you what Wicked is about if you know the Broadway musical. It's a retelling, a backstory to the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz. And this book, I am so proud of myself for having read it. It was the oldest book on my shelves that I bought that I had not read. It was like 12 years old, but I finally read it, and I have to say, I'm glad I read it. I'm a big fan of the musical, so I mainly read this just in anticipation for the movie that came out. I wanted to see like if they were going to add some things, kind of explore more of the political dimensions that the book covers. And that was kind of my experience reading the book. I felt like this was reading like the historical text, the primary documents, whereas Wicked the Musical is kind of like the sanitized public version of it. Because the book is pretty dark. It deals with a lot of philosophical, religious, moral, whatever you name it, those ideas and themes that are like very briefly touched on in the musical, but not to the same extent and center focus as the book places them at. I might make a video going into my thoughts on the book versus the musical versus the movie, just because I had a lot of thoughts going into that. So let me know if that's something that you're interested in. I'll definitely do that. Definitely don't go into this book expecting the musical, but I do think it's actually very valuable to have both stories in your head and see how that adaptation happened. Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century by Kim Fu. This was also a book club pick. My friend brought it to my attention. I wouldn't have known about it otherwise, but it was really interesting. It's basically a collection of short stories that are kind of sci-fi, kind of weird. The back of the book described them as Kafka-esque, but there was really only one or two stories that I thought were really Kafka-esque, and that story actually ended up being my favorite, so I guess it sold me on that. With this book, I'm probably going to put it also in I'm glad I read it. It was definitely a solid read, and I thought that Kim Fu brought up some really interesting ideas. Some of the story leaned toward more of a myth, urban fantasy kind of vibe, very light fantasy though. But some of them were definitely interrogations of our technologically focused society and social media and AI and all these things. So definitely a good one for discussion. Crying in H-Mart by Michelle Zauner. This is a memoir written by Michelle Zauner, who is the lead singer of the band Japanese Breakfast. I wasn't really aware of Japanese Breakfast, but I just thought that this memoir was very highly acclaimed in a lot of reading lists. And it basically explores Michelle Zauner's relationship with her mother, especially after her mom is diagnosed with cancer and passes away. She goes through the process of grieving, of feeling disconnected from her Asian roots because her mother was kind of that access point to Korea for her, and how she's able to kind of rebuild that relationship with her culture through food. Again, I thought it was a pretty solid read. I liked how she brought up some of the complexities that come with a mother-daughter dynamic that can be very fraught. How you can sometimes internalize comments from the people you love, both positive and negative, and also how you can kind of view your childhood differently once presented with like a life or death situation, like her mom being diagnosed with cancer. And it also had a really heartbreaking account of how she witnessed her mother deteriorating from the disease and slowly gaining less and less function. And so I definitely thought it was worth a read, and I'm glad I read it. But I put it a little higher than the others. The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Cerise Zafón. This is also another book that I saw so highly recommended for so many years, so I'm glad I finally read it. This takes place in Barcelona in 1945, and it follows a kid named Daniel. At the beginning of the story, Daniel is 11 years old, and his father, who was a bookseller, takes him to a place called the Cemetery of Forgotten Books and tells him to choose a book that kind of draws him in. And Daniel chooses a book called The Shadow of the Wind by a man named Julian Carax. After finishing the books, he finds out that there are no other copies of this book or any of Julian Carax's books. And he also finds out that someone is collecting all these books and destroying them. So that's where we start, but we follow Daniel and his mystery with Julian Carax for about 6 or 7 years until he turns 18. And at the backdrop of all of this, you are also witnessing Franco Spain and the rise of these authoritarian police forces. So there's a lot going on, a lot of people's past get unraveled, a lot of mysteries are getting woven together. And so I'm gonna give this also Can't Stop Thinking About It. I think I'll put it after The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. Truly just had a great time reading it. I could not stop once I started. I literally wasted time where I should have been studying for an exam finishing this book because after a certain point I was like, I just need to know what happens. If you like gossip, if you like family lore, also strangely, if you like the concept of Phantom of the Opera, it'll make more sense if you read it, but I feel like all those things, like if you like that, you would love this book. Bunny by Mona Awad. This book was wacky, but I had a good time. It basically follows this MFA student at this like Ivy League adjacent school in New England. And in her writing program, there's a group of girls that she calls the Bunnies because they refer to each other only as Bunny. And one day the Bunnies invite the main character to one of their smut salons. And I don't think I should say too much else. I feel like you should just like kind of experience what happens and the weirdness that unfolds. But I think I'm gonna put Bunny in lovely. Not because the story is lovely, but I felt like I really appreciated the craft of storytelling. Like I just felt like I appreciated how Mona Awad constructed this story. It's fairly short. It's like maybe like 200 pages and it goes by very fast. It kind of briefly explores ideas of isolation and loneliness, as well as classism and the environment around academia. And I thought there was an interesting blend of psychological aspects with the uncanny. I do think the story could have gone a little more in depth on some of these things to leave more of an impact, but at the same time, I thought the execution was really effective in it kind of being the psychological thriller in a way. So yeah, I appreciated the craft. Okay, finally, the last 2 books that I have are Amari and the Night Brothers and Amari and the Grey Game by B.B. Alston. I don't know why, but I was kind of in a middle grade mood, and I noticed that I hadn't read any middle grade besides Percy Jackson this year, so I wanted to end my year off with them, and I heard great things about Amari and the Night Brothers. And right off the bat, I'll just say it was lovely. It was so cute. Basically, this is about Amari, who is a 12-year-old girl, and prior to the start of the story, her older brother Quentin, who was like this star student, Ivy League prospect, went missing and is believed to be dead, but she is convinced that he is not dead. She learns that there's actually this secret society of people called supernatural detectives who monitor the relationship between the supernatural and the human world. And in an attempt to find and save her brother, she kind of enlists and tries to become a supernatural detective. Again, this was just a really fun series. It gave me all the vibes that I was looking for in a middle grade series. There's a kind of rush of energy and optimism and just like ambition to save the world that exists in middle grade that is very endearing. Sorry, my camera keeps dying, so I keep slightly changing the angle. But anyway, back to Amari. The book could actually be quite serious at times. Like, there's definitely a lot of metaphors for racism, a lot of metaphors for negative attitudes towards immigrants, and I'm excited to continue with the series. I'm waiting for the next book to come from the library. I did have some minor complaints with the direction that the plot took in some parts, particularly in the first book, but I think the second book kind of set up a direction that I'm really interested in exploring. So I'm hoping that as the series continues, it just kind of gets better and better each time. But that is it. Those are the books that I read in 2024, tier ranked. I didn't even intend this, but this is kind of beautiful, this like pyramid I made. And I don't know, I also like the assortment of books that I read. Like I feel like I read so many different things, explored new genres, tried new authors. So even though like the amount of books that I read was similar to previous years, like I don't know, I feel kind of proud of this. And also, I didn't really intend for this video to be like mini reviews of each book, but honestly, I'm not mad at it because I really just wanted some way to reflect on all these books that I read, kind of wrap that up so I can head into 2025 knowing that I at least talked about all of these. And with that, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you later. Bye.